You're listening to the FQxI podcast. Today,
the question is, what's the inner connection between quantum features like, for example, superposition of states, tunneling, or coherence, or even entanglement? Do they play a role within living systems?
FQxI's $53,000 essay competition asks, how quantum is life?
This might reshape a lot of ideas related to life, which can have an impact in medicine, in neuroscience, but also in our philosophical understanding of what life is.
The roots of plant intelligence?
So it looks like this may carry information which looks like the seeds are talking to each other. This points towards a primitive form of what somebody might call plant intelligence.
What do physicists really think about the Big Bang, dark matter, quantum theory, black holes, parallel universes, quantum gravity, and fine-tuning?
What we talk about as being the most popular opinion or what's typically taught to undergrads, it turns out a lot of that isn't true almost for any question.
Plus, a number of science journals are experimenting with paying scientists to serve as expert peer reviewers. Is it worth it?
I've met graduate students who lived in their cars. I do not think you should be asking them to work for free.
And could AI serve as a reviewer of scientific papers?
And so an AI editor reads the paper and selects 3 AI reviewers that are experts in various fields that are relevant to that paper. So if I'm an AI neuroscientist, I'll give them kind of feedback on the neuroscience aspects of the paper. Maybe I'm an AI statistician, I'll give the statistics outputs. And the reviews are, I was very surprised, the reviews are really, really good.
I'm Zeeya Merali. Welcome to the podcast from the Foundational Questions Institute. We have a bumper edition for you, and I want to start with a quick bit of housekeeping. You'll soon hear from FQxI member and quantum physicist Catalina Curceanu of INFN in Italy, who will be talking about FQxI's $53,000 essay competition. But I want to alert everyone that FQxI has changed the previously advertised deadline to the 29th of October. So if you haven't yet entered, there is still plenty of time. That's an extension from the previously shared deadline. So yes, let's dive straight in now with Catalina Curceanu, who conducts experiments investigating the nature of dark matter and quantum mechanics as part of her day job, but also dabbles in some more interdisciplinary research, which made her an ideal person to help organise FQxI's latest competition. Hello, Catalina. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Zeeya, for inviting me.
Please tell us about the topic of this year's essay competition, presented in partnership with the Paradox Science Institute.
The title is about quantum biology. So it's really very exciting field, which I think will give us a lot of joy in the near future. It's trying to search whether genuine quantum effects beyond the obvious one, like explaining the atoms themselves, play a role in living systems.
The essay contest title is How Quantum is Life. But Catalina, what sort of questions might people try to address in their answers? And again, these are only examples, I should say. These are only examples. You can answer what you wish.
Sure. I think that's a very, very exciting field because I think we are on the verge of some very interesting research we can eventually start to do in this context of quantum and life. So now we know we are building quantum computers and we do a lot of quantum sensing. But the question is, what's the inner connection, the deep connection between quantum features like, for example, superposition of states, tunneling, or coherence in this context, or even entanglement? Do they play a role within living systems? And this role can extend from an incredible efficiency of the energy transfer, of the transfer of energy, to eventual effects, quantum effects in the brain. Why not even in consciousness? And this might reshape a lot of ideas related to life, which can have an impact in medicine, in neuroscience, but also in our philosophical understanding of what life is, which dates back to Schrödinger and even before Schrödinger. So what kind of questions we may try to address in this essay? Well, we can, of course, ask if could quantum phenomena be harnessed in biology to enhance the processes like the energy transfer or sensing? Or do quantum features play a role in cognition or in neural processes? What about our consciousness? What about the quantum thermodynamics in cell or definitions of complexity and entropy in living systems? Do living systems use quantum features to communicate? These are only some examples. I can imagine that who's listening to us might have thousands of even better examples.
And as always, the competition is open to everyone. You can be a professional scientist. I mean, in this case, I suppose it'll be especially exciting for physicists and biologists, but anyone, but not just a scientist. You could be a non-scientist who just finds this topic fascinating. In the past, we have had high school students winning. We have had non-scientists. We have had people who have entered works of fiction that have won special prizes. So I think we're very excited about what we might get from this. And the way these competitions work is that once your paper or your essay has been deemed eligible and it's met some very basic eligibility criteria, it's posted to the FQxI website where anybody can read it. You'll have an anonymous identity, so nobody will know who you are, what your background is. It'll be judged completely fairly. The public can read the essays and, give them a thumbs up. And based on the evaluations of some expert readers and also the other entrants and FQxI members, we will choose a number of top-rated finalists. Those will then be judged by an expert judging panel. And only after the winners have been chosen will everybody's identities be revealed. So, very exciting. I can tell you that, last year we had a nice surprise. It was a non-scientist who won the essay competition, and let's see what happens this year.
And as you are saying, the nice thing about this is that it's open to a very broad community. So it creates an intellectual, very vibrant intellectual space to cross between borders, to do a cross-disciplinary minds coming together and inquiry in a way which has not possibly been done before. So it's courage, being brave, and why not embracing new ideas, still staying on a solid scientific ground, of course. My wish, if I can say so, since nobody hears us, I can tell you, and my deepest hope is that we will move from a competition to something which is able to support experiments. So not only put them in an essay, but really doing them. So once we go into the wild with what we could do, my real dream is to really do it, to go in the lab and transform what will be the winner or some of this essay, to transform them in real experiments.
Well, I have some bad news for you, Catalina. There will be people listening to this podcast, so they'll know your secret wish.
Oh, my God.
And it's well worth entering because the first prizes are worth $10,000. The total prize pot is $53,000, and we have to be very grateful and thankful to our competition partners here, the Paradox Science Institute. I will be putting links to the essay competition on the podcast page, qspace.fqxi.org/podcasts. And so, of course, head over there. There'll also be links in the show notes for you to find out just how to enter the essay competition. And you can also have a look around and have a look at some of the winners from our previous essay competitions. Well, Catalina, I have to ask you about some of your other interests in terms of bringing together biology and physics. And, we've talked about broadening the community. We've talked about this collective intelligence. But, when I say plant intelligence, What does that mean to you? I know that you have been looking into this question of the intelligence of plants. So please tell us, what does that even mean?
Yeah, it looks a bit crazy, to be honest, because I've been working for nearly 30 years in searching for particles, for quantum processes, and whatever which involves physics as we know it. But quite recently, together with some colleagues, we started to measure something very interesting, the so-called biophotons, which means an emission of light, very, very weak, within biological systems.
Are biophotons something that scientists know are emitted by all living organisms? Do humans emit biophotons? Or is it something that has only been seen in certain plants? Is it seen in animals?
No, apparently all living systems, including plants I mentioned before, but animals, even humans, and even cells, emit this very ultra-weak light emission. And we still do not really understand what's the mechanism generating it, where they come from. Is this related with the metabolism, or what is the origin of these biophotons? And we started to measure this with our photodetectors, which are measuring visible light. They might extend beyond the visible light. And we studied plants, so seeds of lentils, which we put in a dark, shielded environment. And we measured the very weak light these biophotons emitted by these lentils while they were germinating. And it was very interesting to see that the light, the pattern of this light, it's not, let's say, neutral or, let's say, it has some features inside. And it looks like a grammar. So it looks like this may carry information which looks like the seeds are talking to each other via this light. And this points towards a primitive form of what somebody, including me, might call plant intelligence.
These are, incredibly profound questions you're asking. And when you're speaking about it in terms of the plants, you're talking about some kind of communication. I mean, it sounds scary. It sounds like, science fiction or the Day of the Triffids. But what kind of communication are we talking about? What sort of things would they want to communicate to each other? And then, one step further, when it's animals, what role might the biophotons be playing? Because we don't need to emit light, a very, very faint glow of light, to communicate.
I can only speculate at this point because I don't really have answers. I have more questions than answers. So what we believe, but we need to prove this, we are scientists, so we would like to prove this, that these biophotons and the patterns we started to measure are pointing towards an emerging cooperative behavior among cells. So it's clear that we might not use it to communicate because we can talk, we see each other, but they might play a role in what happens inside our body. So since we are forming from the two cells which come together and our body starts to form itself, how liver knows it should be a liver and the brain to be a brain and the heart to be a heart. So somehow the organism should communicate within and information should be changed. Otherwise it would be a total chaos. So it might be that part of this communication passes through electromagnetic signals. After all, we are electromagnetic, I don't want to say machines, but electromagnetic devices in a lot of things, which chemical and electromagnetic devices. But there is information, otherwise we wouldn't even be born as we are. And what we have seen, this type of biophotons, exactly when the plants are germinating, so when they form as plant, points to this question. So I'm not saying an answer because we don't have it yet, but whether this might have a role when life is forming, it's taking shape. Isn't this exciting? So might they be layers of communications we've never tapped into up to now?
And so then I guess in the context of plants, you're also thinking about communication in the sense of communicating signals about how to grow. as opposed to having a conversation and saying, hello, how are you?
How to grow and how to grow healthy.
Right.
That's only the beginning. Of course, that we would like to broaden our research, teaming up with biologists and understand whether these biophotons are indeed used not only by plants, but by broader biological systems, including us, humans. And can this light be used to carry useful information? Can this be used to develop diagnostical tools or even detect disease or stress into living systems?
People have been thinking about biophotons in the context of diagnosing health issues or thinking about medical treatments for human beings. So what would that entail?
Well, I think that one can imagine, but again, don't take me for granted. I'm not a biologist in no way, and I don't want to pose as one. But one might eventually, if indeed these biophotons are emitted by all organisms, including ourselves, one may at some point imagine that the information they can carry can teach us something very fast about the health situation of an organism, of an organ, or of an organism as a whole. And that would be very, very interesting. And even more, are these biophotons connected with quantum mechanism when they are generated? This looks indeed totally exciting and interesting. And for me, it's already crossing borders, which kind of 10 years ago, I would have never dreamed I could do so. And it's a lot of fun, a lot of interesting features we are uncovering.
Now, I will be putting on the podcast page, qspace.fqxi.org/podcasts, a link to Catalina's review paper with her colleagues talking about her work with biophotons and reviewing lots of work about biophotons over the decades.
The secret will be unveiled.
The secret will be unveiled, but let me unveil some more secrets with you, Catalina, and dig into your mind. I'm going to ask you a few questions here. We should mention, this isn't your day job. You're not mainly involved in looking at biophotons. Your day job involves experiments that deal with other things, maybe much more to do with foundational physics. So I'm just going to give you some very quick fire questions here, and you don't have to put a lot of thought into it. Just tell me instinctively, what is your answer here? So the first question is, what is your favorite interpretation of quantum mechanics?
Well, I'm biased because I'm an experimentalist. And as an experimentalist, my bias is that I want to measure something. So in this context, not that it's my favorite, but since I can work on it, it's to radically modify quantum mechanics, so the collapse models. I know that's not the view of many of my colleagues, but I'd like to see something new. So not to look for interpretation, but to see something kind of a wow, that's different than I thought before.
Right, so this is a not so much an interpretation of quantum mechanics, but a slightly modified version of quantum mechanics in which the size or mass of the system will cause a quantum system to collapse. And you can do experiments.
It would be something which is beyond quantum physics. And I know that sounds crazy. I'm not crazy not to know that sounds crazy. But that would be super cool. There are no signs that this might be the case, but I'm looking for them.
Next question. What do you think dark matter is made of?
Oh, that's a very complicated question, but I think it's made of many particles which similarly to the normal matter. So the important thing is to find one which will also show us how we can look for the other ones.
Okay, interesting. We'll keep hold of that. We'll remember Catalina's words. And third question. If I say to you, Big Bang, what does that mean to you?
Basically, it means that we have a physics theory about how the universe began. Might not be the true one, might not be the final one, but to me, it gives a very comforting thought that we can even have a theory about how everything began.
Now, there's a reason why I've been asking you these questions. I apologize for putting you on the spot here, but our listeners who listened to the previous episode will have heard the first part of our interview with cosmologists Alice Chen and Niayesh Afshordi from the Perimeter Institute in Waterloo, Canada. Last episode, they were talking about some big results about the nature of dark energy that came out, and they began to talk about a survey that they carried out at a conference last year, where they polled 85 physicists and asked them their views on various controversial or unresolved questions in physics to see what most physicists think. And if you go to the last edition, you will be able to hear our discussion of what most physicists thought about the nature of dark energy and what they thought about the nature of the Hubble tension. So if you haven't listened to that already, please head over to the podcast page, qspace.fqxi.org/podcasts, and you can listen to part 1. In the second part of our interview, we are now going to turn to what is physicists' favourite interpretation of quantum mechanics? Do physicists believe in the multiverse? What do they think the dark matter is made up of? What does the term Big Bang mean to them? What is their favourite possibility for the nature of quantum gravity? What do they think about questions of fine-tuning and the anthropic principle? So now let's go back to cosmologist Niayesh Afshordi and his student Alice Chen, who told me the results of the survey that surprised them and interested them the most.
The most surprising result was that there was no consensus on anything, except one: string theory, inflation, cosmological constant. Okay, so there were popular ideas. 30-something% of people, I think, believe in a cosmological constant, but nothing actually exceeded 50%. So there was no majority consensus on any contentious question we asked, with one exception, and that exception was what was Big Bang. And this is very interesting and very surprising in the sense that most textbooks, at least when I was a kid, and it was back in 1800s or whatever it was, when we read things, it said like Big Bang was the beginning of the universe. The universe started with the Big Bang. In fact, there was a TV show, if I remember, a very popular one. Is that it all started at the hot dense state. The universe started in a hot density. So that was the Big Bang theory. And most physicists, 68%, don't think that's what Big Bang is. Big Bang was not the start of time, the beginning of time, or a singularity, like an infinite dense state. Big Bang, now we believe that it was a state of a universe which is very hot and very dense, but that was not the beginning of time. I mean, doesn't tell you anything about the beginning of time. Maybe there was a beginning of time, maybe there wasn't, but the Big Bang doesn't say anything about that. I think it's a shift in opinions, right? That, again, textbooks in the 60s and the 70s, they were saying that the universe started with the Big Bang from a point. And now we know better. We are kind of explored what that means, what that statement, which is a very simplistic statement, actually means. And I think many cosmologists and physicists have come to the conclusion that that statement doesn't make any sense on its face. Now, still a possibility, but we kind of lost track of what the right physics is when we get to those stages, when the universe becomes too dense and too hot. So anything goes, and we even wrote a book about that. It's called Battle of the Big Bang.
Yes, that was with Phil Halper, and we will be, as a little bit of a teaser for you, we will be having another conversation with you, Niayesh, at a later date with Phil to talk about your new book too, The Battle of the Big Bang. I'm just looking at your results here, and it does look like about 17% of people have said that there is an absolute beginning of time, either with or without a singularity. But yeah, that's quite a dramatic difference between 68% and 17%. I'll also give a little shout out to myself to a podcast episode that I recorded for Nature, which came out in April, called What's in a Name. It was episode 3 of their series, What's in a Name. And it dealt with this question about Maybe not the meaning exactly of the Big Bang, but the use of the term Big Bang and how it is used differently by different physicists, astronomers, cosmologists. I very much wish I had your survey when I was recording that, because I think it would have been very interesting information. But I'll put a link to that too on the podcast page, qspace.fqxi.org/podcasts. And you can listen to the opinions of George Ellis, a very eminent cosmologist, and Chandra Prescott-Weinstein on that. Alice, let me ask you, we've had Niayesh's, his choice of the most surprising or interesting result. What was your favorite result from the survey?
So I think overall, actually, this survey was very eye-opening. The fact that what we talk about as being the most popular opinion, or what's typically taught to undergrads, or what we typically think is the consensus in physics, actually, once you take this survey, you look at the results, it turns out a lot of that isn't true, almost for any question. So I think overall, that is a result to note. But for me personally, and this is biased because this is related to my area of research, I thought it was interesting, and that made me very hopeful, is that lots of people thought dark matter was some hybrid. So that's the most popular result at 31%. But what we typically learn in the standard cosmological model, and what's typically researched in the mainstream at least, is that dark matter is just one type of particle, or it's a substance with one component. Depending on who you ask, the component could be primordial black holes, it could be a bright-handed neutrino, or it could be very heavy non-relativistic particle at the time of matter radiation decoupling that we don't know what it is yet. But actually, most physicists think it's some hybrid. So it's not just one component, which does make sense when you consider that baryonic matter is very complicated. We have the standard model, and that doesn't even explain everything. So that's only 5% of the energy density of the universe as opposed to 25%. So there's very little reason to think why dark matter should just be one type of particle.
I was also very interested that primordial black holes, came up with 17%, or they got the results of 17%, the backing of 17% of the people surveyed. Largely because I have a recording of a conversation that will go out onto the podcast after yours with Bernard Carr. And one thing that came up with him was he spoke about his love of primordial black holes, and he has been working on this for more than 50 years. And one of the things that came up was the way that fashions and trends change in cosmology, and how things fall into fashion and fall out of fashion. And so for a while, this was thought to be an absolutely crazy idea. And then at other times, it's a very popular idea. And I think he would be extremely happy to have seen that 17%. And that's actually the second highest, after the 31% of people who said some hybrid was the solution to dark matter, that people are backing primordial black holes. I should have explained as well that a primordial black hole is a hypothetical black hole. So it's not quite the same as the black holes that we know exist out there in the universe that resulted from stars collapsing and crunching down and becoming black holes. But these are hypothesized to maybe have been created in the very early universe. So people who want to know more about primordial black holes, stay tuned for a later edition. We'll be talking about them in a lot of depth.
But it does come with a caveat that was a black hole conference. So people were predisposed to thinking about black holes. And it seems that basically there was a group of people who just answered primordial black holes to everything. For example, they thought that primordial black holes were the seeds of supermassive black holes. Primordial black holes were dark matter. So they were just people who like primordial black holes. And yeah, so I think there is this caveat there. Maybe if you do this survey in another conference with a different focus, then you may get a slightly different answer. But then, I love primordial black holes as well. I worked on them. I'm good friends with Bernard as well. So we worked on similar topics. So that's certainly a possibility. And I think we should take all the possibilities at the same level of seriousness.
The other thing that was interesting on this dark matter one, I was kind of curious that modified gravity as an alternative to dark matter only got the support of about 1% of people. But then it got a higher percentage as a potential solution to dark energy. I don't know if you have any thoughts of that, but that was kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, so the issue of dark matter and dark energy, and that's a very fascinating one. Dark matter is an older topic than the dark energy. So we've known about the idea of dark matter since, in fact, Fritz Zwicky, back in the 30s, he observed that galaxies and clusters, and they're moving around too fast for the gravity of the stars we saw. So he said that there must be some sort of missing matter there that gravitates. That's a much older topic, and since then, there have been a lot more observation of dark matter on various fronts, from galaxies to clusters of galaxies to cosmic microwave background. Dark energy, by comparison, is a newer topic in terms of observational evidence for it. That's not as much, and it's mainly from expansion of the universe, expansion and geometry of universe the past few billion years. So there's kind of one type of observation, really. So there's more playroom there. With dark matter, it's difficult because, no one has really managed to come up with a good model of kind of modified gravity that replicates the effect of dark matter. These are all like incredibly baroque, contrived models, and they always kind of can fit something, but then other things have trouble fitting. The biggest problem is with the structure or the fluctuations of cosmic microwave background, which is very well described by cold dark matter, but modified gravity models, they just have trouble getting this right. There have been recent progress on it, but it's not really at the same level of maturity. And this is why most astronomers and astrophysicists are kind of skeptical of this modified gravity as a dark matter model. But dark energy, especially with more recent developments, we are more open-minded, and all these tensions maybe suggest that maybe there is more to dark energy than meets the eye.
I guess, though, given that you'd made that point of noting that some people are just fans of primordial black holes and tick that in every box, it's interesting that you don't have the same effect with modified gravity. So that there's a bit of thought going into there. It's not just some people are crazy about modified gravity. So let's just quickly run through some of the highlights of the survey, because, as you say, you covered a lot of ground. And one topic that comes up so often on the podcast and in our discussions is the black hole information paradox. What were you trying to get at in terms of the answers, and what answers did you find?
So black hole information paradox is one of the greatest mysteries of physics. In fact, this is the 50th anniversary of the black hole information paradox. The story was Hawking discovered that black holes are not black. If you add quantum mechanics, it seems that black holes can radiate energy, and by energy conservation, that suggests that they should evaporate. And then the big mystery was what happens to the information that falls into the black holes, because according to quantum mechanics, which was really the reason we thought black holes weren't black, so that was the foundation of calculations that Hawking did. Quantum mechanics also tells us that information cannot be destroyed. That was a big mystery, and for a while Hawking was on the camp that maybe information is not conserved. Maybe black holes can kill information. But then towards the end of his life, last maybe 20 years or so, he kind of changed his mind, and many physicists, especially those who worked on high energy physics, kind of started to change their mind that maybe, in fact, quantum mechanics is more fundamental than gravity, or at least Einstein's theory of gravity. Now, exactly how this paradox is solved, or whether it is really a paradox, because, we saw there is not even a consensus on that. Some people think maybe information is lost. But even if it's not lost, how it's kind of recovered, there's a lot of disagreement on it.
Alice, what was the most popular answer on that one?
So the most popular answer by 1% is that the black hole information loss, or the information that's said to be lost, is preserved in Hawking radiation. It is 1% more popular at 27% than the second option, which is it's preserved in remnant at 26%. This is one of the questions that I would say the answers had a pretty even split. The highest was 27%, as we just said, and the lowest was no opinion at 10%.
Yeah, and its irretrievably lost was 22%, which is high.
Yeah.
Let's turn to the next question. Alice, it's about supermassive black hole formation. Well, explain to us, what is a supermassive black hole and what is the confusion about it?
Supermassive black holes are black holes that we think are at the center of large central galaxies, such as the Milky Way. And the confusion about it is essentially how they formed. And that's what this question asks. So we know stellar mass black holes, as you mentioned earlier, are from the collapse of massive stars collapsing under their own gravity, and to the extent of where neutron degeneracy and electron degeneracy pressure cannot hold up the gravity any longer, so they collapse to a black hole. But then these stellar mass black holes are much smaller than the supermassive black holes that we think exist at the center of the galaxy. And how they formed and how they got to the size is still a mystery. So that's what this question asks. And the most popular answer to this was no opinion. You go from a minimum of 6%, which is other or sub-Eddington accretion, to no opinion, which is 30%.
Oh dear, and that's at a conference with black hole experts.
It could be just because this problem is more astrophysical in origin as opposed to looking at the quantum gravity side of black holes. But yeah, a lot of people apparently don't have much of an opinion on this.
So it's not so much disagreement as just really confusion with this one, it looks like.
It does look like it, yeah.
I should add, it is a very confusing field. The question is, how do you get from like a 10 solar mass black hole to a billion solar mass black hole? And is there enough time in the universe to do that? And there's a limit, the so-called Eddington limit, on how fast black holes can grow. And yeah, is that a serious limit or not? There is disagreement on that. And then maybe black holes can form, just skip the stars, and just suddenly the whole cloud just collapses into a black hole. That's a possibility. We haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean it cannot happen, because a lot of what we know in astrophysics is from observations, and we haven't really observed things in early times in any detail. So indeed, there's a lot of confusion, which is typical of the frontiers of astrophysics.
Before we go on to the next question, let me just ask you a bit more of a sociological question. And maybe this speaks to the motivation about why you set up the survey, or maybe it's irrelevant. But we talked about the terminology, for instance, used about the Big Bang. And we talked about how opinions change over time, about primordial black holes. We're talking about things where people are really disagreeing here. We're talking about questions that people are just confused about. What's your sort of takeaway message in terms of the way that these questions and answers are reported in the press, but also not just in the press and to the public, but how physicists talk about these questions and answers with each other, the language that they use, and the certainty or the confidence that they express in their papers about their favorite ideas or solutions? Do you think that sometimes there's an overexpression of confidence in papers that scientists write? Or do you think that people are upfront about, okay, this is my opinion, but maybe not everybody else's opinion? Do you think people even know that there is this level of confusion, physicists themselves? Niayesh.
I say Alice should answer this.
Okay, Alice.
Yeah, so maybe I can give the very novice opinion on this, and then Niayesh can give the more expert opinion on this. From the perspective of learning about some of these concepts as a student, there is a bit of a bias in what we're taught. And I think that may lead to what is generally known to the public as being an agreed upon theory of physics. And so an example is that if we go to the question interpretation of quantum mechanics, there is the option of Copenhagen interpretation and many other options. But if you were to give me the survey, I only know Copenhagen. So there really is no way for me to comment or to have an opinion on which one is correct, because I literally have not learned the other ones. And I think this is not uncommon among students, right? Like in undergrad, we're taught the Copenhagen interpretation and we're not taught anything else. So I think that the open question, at least at a junior level, is not explored nearly enough.
That's really interesting, especially from the perspective of somebody who's coming in as a student and is, missing out on some of these other alternative ideas. Niayesh, then, coming from the perspective of someone who, if I may say, has worked on some speculative ideas as well. So you're coming from maybe sometimes slightly off the mainstream with some of your ideas. Do you think that there is perhaps an overconfidence expressed about some ideas, that some things are expressed as being mainstream, but maybe they're more speculative?
Yeah, I guess speaking of off the mainstream, I guess I have maybe off mainstream opinions about this as well, which is to say that, the way leaders lead in human societies is by exuding confidence, right? So that's how movements start. If someone sounds confident and speaks in a confident way, then other people are likely to believe them, right? So this is how movements start and famous politicians. It's not that necessarily when politicians speak, being Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders or whoever, it's not that necessarily they know things better or study things better than others. They're not scientists, but they speak confidently, and that's what makes others follow them. And to be honest, that's not that different in science. That I think confidence is not necessarily a statement of knowledge or certainty about something, but rather a leadership quality. Now, you would hope that there is some correlation between the level of confidence, at least for scientists, and the actual certainty. I hope so too.
Yes, you didn't sound very convinced when you said that. And I think for the sake of all of us, I'm not going to ask you on the record who you consider the Donald Trump of physics to be and who you consider the Bernie Sanders of physics to be. We'll let that one slide. But let's talk about this interpretation of quantum mechanics since you brought it up, Alice. And we've got here, the Copenhagen interpretation. That's the sort of the traditional one, which is almost a sort of, don't worry about it kind of interpretation of, weird stuff is happening. Let's not worry about it. Let's just do the calculations. That's coming in at 28%, which is second only to no opinion. And then you're getting a result which is not inconsistent with when we've done surveys at FQxI meetings on this question, which is that many worlds is pretty popular at 11%. You've got collapse theories, which relate the transition between the kind of fuzzy quantum world to the world we see around us to a mechanism that is related to perhaps the mass of a system. It reaches a certain threshold and then it collapses and it loses its quantum properties and becomes more consistent with what we see around us. You've got sort of deterministic theories, pilot wave, de Broglie-Bohm coming in at 4%, and cubism, which I won't even attempt to define because I'll get an angry message from cubists telling me that I've defined it incorrectly, at 0%. I think what I'm seeing here is that you're chuckling away, but what I'm seeing here, I feel like this is one which is definitely affected by the people that you survey. I've seen surveys carried out at meetings with people who are really into quantum foundations, and there, cubism goes up, many worlds goes down. It's one of those things that sort of, it's very interesting who you ask with a question about interpretations of quantum mechanics. Mm-hmm. That's not really a question, that was kind of a statement, I suppose, but I don't know if you want to add anything.
We are attempting to do this survey for a broader audience. I don't know if I'm at liberty to say which group of people, but I think maybe with a big professional physics society. But indeed, this is an issue that if you haven't spent time, like Alice mentioned, basically this, you haven't really spent time or haven't read an article about this or and no one has told you about it. All it is just, have you heard about it? And I think for many of these people, yes, most people have heard about Copenhagen. Also, it helped that the survey happened in Copenhagen, so hopefully people had heard about Copenhagen. Many words is probably the second most popular interpretation people have heard about. There's this multiverse and all the movies and whatever. There was Doctor Strange. Is that in multiverse? Is that right? Yeah. So that's, of course, popular in that sense. And on the other ones, basically, a very niche group of people have heard about it. But I think there is this interesting thing. I think somebody was asking me, is it even fair to ask specialized questions in a broad conference like this? Because these people haven't studied this, so why should they have an opinion? Or why should their opinion count? And I think my answer was, at the end of the day, it's the broader community who judges you in terms of when you get funding, or when, even broader than that, it's the taxpayers who fund us for the most part. So, okay, some of us are funded by billionaires, and then most of us are funded by taxpayers. But I suppose even for billionaires, you have to actually explain things, and then they have their own opinions. And that's the thing, is that this broader community are the ones who form the opinion, and their opinion decides where the money goes ultimately. And then, so these opinions, I think, does matter. That suggests that these kind of interactions we have, that kind of outreach is important. We might be an expert in our field, but if nobody else understands what we're doing, then it's as if you're not doing it, right?
I completely agree with you for whatever my opinion is worth on this, simply because you want to encourage, I think, interdisciplinary research. If you want to, and interdisciplinary here is even disciplines within physics, if you want to solve some of these big mysteries. And even on that funding issue, I think it's, not to try to avoid going back to Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, but I think one of the things we've seen over the past decade or whatever is how people can become very siloed or be within their little bubbles. And I don't know if physicists and scientists realize how niche their areas are and, how small their bubble is unless you carry out these kind of surveys. And then perhaps the people that are really experts on it would be saying, my goodness me, I can't believe that, 57% of people think this and they should really know a lot better. So, it's up to you to go out and talk about your work to a wider audience. Let's get back to the survey. Alice, there's another one, Niayesh mentioned the multiverse there, and some of these are really sort of sci-fi questions, and one of the fun ones, which I was surprised wasn't mentioned in the question on what happens to information in a black hole, but you do have a question about the fate of matter in black holes, which is all kinds of fun when you think about possibilities. So if you could just talk us through some of these, because they're just very cute, I think, the answers on what happens to the fate of matter when it gets crushed inside a black hole, if it gets crushed inside a black hole?
Yeah, this is a fun question because in some sense we don't really have a good way of knowing. I don't know if we'll ever have a good way of knowing. It seems that whatever goes inside a black hole needs to sign some sort of NDA, or otherwise it can't come out, or it just doesn't come out. Bouncing into another universe, I think the easiest way to maybe interpret this answer is that you have an object going into a black hole and then it comes out of a white hole on the other side, so like the wormhole theory. Now you could have this without a white hole in some very exotic black hole models. I'm not quite sure how that works because, sorry, this is a bit outside my area of expertise. Maybe Niayesh can comment on this a bit later. It seems like for this question, most people think that matter gets crushed into a singularity inside the black hole. I'm not sure if this just becomes part of the singularity, or they think that you have these mini singularities inside the singularity of the black hole. Other options think that it becomes a fuzzball, it bounces into a universe or into another universe. These all seem to be of the same order of magnitude of popularity. You have 10 to 16%. So maybe fuzzball is more popular than we think it is. But yeah, it does seem like there's really no consensus on this question.
I will put a link to an article about fuzzballs from one of the proponents of fuzzballs to save us trying to debate what a fuzzball is. I'm laughing at one of the notes that you've written in your paper for, I guess, when people have ticked the box for other. And this is under testing quantum gravity models with black holes. And I guess there had been quite a few others on that one, 32%. And you had written, the nature of such methods remains an enigma to the authors of this article. So I think you've been very humble about your own confusion of what people are suggesting here.
Yeah, maybe one thing actually when we're talking about singularities, I think one thing that was paradoxical about the way people think, I think we had this question of singularity, and so for the black holes, I think around 30%, they think 29% think that things crash into a singularity. But for the Big Bang, the singularity for the Big Bang, there was, I guess it's maybe 10% think it's less than 10% think it was a singularity. So this question of, do people think there's a singularity or not a singularity? Does singularity make sense? It seems that people in different contexts think about it very differently, like in the context of Big Bang or black holes. Although from the point of view of general relativity, I mean, they're both the same kind of singularities, because one was in the past, the other is in the future. But apparently, yeah, people think about it very differently.
There are a couple of questions about quantum gravity. Did you find anything particularly interesting or surprising amongst that, either in what people think the nature of quantum gravity will be or ways to test it?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about quantum gravity in general is there is no consensus. I mean, there is a lot of confusion. A string theory is usually described as a front runner, but in our survey, it was only 21% of the people who thought string theory is the leading theory of quantum gravity, which is, or at least their favorite theory of quantum gravity, which is mind-boggling because in terms of number of people who work on any proposal for quantum gravity, a string theory is like orders of magnitude bigger than anything else, maybe all the others combined. That was very surprising. The same, in fact, goes with inflation, which is again by orders of magnitude more popular than any other model of the early universe. And here is still like, I think 30 something percent. So less than majority. Those are the surprising things about quantum gravity and I guess maybe quantum beginning of our universe.
It's 44% for inflation.
Right.
I was just looking at that because we have a lot of FQxI members who are very invested in inflation. So they'll at least be pleased to know that they got 44%, which was very good. I guess the only other thing that we haven't really covered is the anthropic principle and fine-tuning. Alice, do you want to explain to us what is the fine-tuning issue? What do we mean by anthropic coincidences? And then what were the results?
Right. So the fine-tuning issue is actually kind of related to dark matter, dark energy we were talking about earlier. And that's saying that right now what we observe is that dark matter and dark energy are the same order of magnitude. So even though we have more dark energy in the energy density, it's like 0.25 to approximately 0.7. So it's not something like 1 billion to 1 or something crazy like that. And in order for life to exist, or at least life as humans we know to exist in our current state, we need the dark energy, dark matter ratio to be at this order of magnitude. But there's infinitely many possibilities for what the ratio of dark energy to dark matter could be. And the fact that it's precisely this ratio that allows life to form, that allows us to observe it, is what's known as the anthropic coincidence.
When you surveyed people, what were the options and what were the answers?
So the options given were the values of the constants are set by necessity. They are brute force facts and don't need any further explanation. This problem is explained by an anthropic selection in a multiverse. It's explained by a Darwinian process occurring in the cosmos, explained by an intelligent designer, other, or no opinion. Yeah, so the most popular one does seem to be their brute force facts and need no further explanation. It just means that this is what we observe, this is what happens. We don't necessarily need a reason behind why. But actually, anthropic selection and multiverse also was the second most popular at 24%. And that's saying you may have many universes which have very different ratios of dark matter to dark energy or vice versa. And that the anthropic selection just means we're here to observe it, and that's the universe that got picked from our reference point.
Yeah, I think what is very interesting there actually is the brute facts answer is so high. And maybe, I guess as we're wrapping up, maybe, that's another message here that sometimes, to one physicist, something is a big problem that needs to be solved. It brings us back to sort of the Hubble tension question, the crisis in cosmology. But to somebody else, and maybe to even a majority of other physicists, it's not really an issue. You're dedicating your life to trying to solve a paradox or a puzzle. But for maybe a lot of your colleagues, they're just sitting there thinking, it's not, I'm not worried about it at all.
Yeah, so I think this is an excellent observation. And indeed, what is a problem to you is not, something that might be at some level personal, but also at some level a social question, right? It depends on who you hang out with, really. So if your friends think something is a problem, that becomes a problem to you. But also, a slightly longer term, and again, when you become as old as I or Zeeya, you start to think about these long-term questions. Okay, maybe even if you're younger, you can worry about that. In fact, actually, I think this is an important thing for maybe young scientists to think about, like Alice may start worry about that. You might like a problem very much, but can you make progress in it? And that's important, right? Because if there are kind of low-hanging fruits or fruits that are within reach, then you could start working on it, and that kind of starts excitement and movement on a problem. And then that's how problem becomes important. It's not something fundamental to the problem, but also whether the progress is happening or is achievable. These are not really just physics questions. They are also, in some sense, philosophy questions and sociology questions and history questions, and they are all intertwined with each other.
That was Niayesh Afshordi and Alice Chen talking through their survey of 85 physicists. I will put a link to their paper on the podcast page, qspace.fqxi.org/podcasts. So, Catalina, what do you think? When these physicists were polled about their favourite interpretation of quantum mechanics, they said, the most popular result was no opinion. And the second most popular result was the Copenhagen interpretation. Your favourite response came in at 7%.
It doesn't surprise me because many of my colleagues do not use to think about what quantum mechanics tells us. That's a pity. I can tell them they lose something. I know why they don't do this, because you can't each morning. If you want to make progress in particle physics, you need to run, to do things. So you can't stay there and wonder from the morning to the evening what quantum mechanics means. But every now and then it would be healthy exercise to do so. So no, I'm not surprised, but I'm a bit disappointed. That's true.
And for dark matter, I'm sure you're curious. The most popular result was some hybrid. And the second most popular, as mentioned in the interview, was primordial black holes. What did you think of that?
Well, the hybrid, I think, makes sense. That's more or less what I was thinking. The second one, primordial black holes, I think reflects the conference. So if this was taken in a conference, probably the conference was strongly biased towards this type of issue. So again, I'm not surprised because 85 persons, it's after all a very small sample, so might not be representative of what the majority of scientists think.
It was indeed a black hole conference, and I think, yes. There you go. We can give Catalina the results and she can identify the conference without telling her, just based on the results given.
It's not me being brilliant, it's easy. If I can make a comment on this, I would be not surprised if you will learn many different things. That shouldn't scare people. That means that the science is healthy. Having more opinion than one, it's a sign of health in science. I think that's how the future is coming into being in science, by many different opinions.
Now, on the subject of surveys, last year FQxI surveyed its own members about journals, scientific publishing, and the topic of peer review. Now, for those of you who may not know the process, what usually happens when a scientist writes a paper is that they need to have it published in a peer-reviewed journal. So they will submit it to a journal of their choice. Editors at the journal will look at it, and if they think it's reasonably good and something they would like to publish, they then send it out to experts in the field to look over and decide whether or not it should be published, whether it should be rejected, or maybe it could be modified. Those outside experts are called peer reviewers. And we carried out a long survey with our members and asked them various questions about how happy they were with this process. And one thing that came up was that 59% of our survey responders said that peer reviewers should be paid for their work. I wonder, what are your thoughts on this question, Catalina? I mean, we also asked, incidentally, whether authors should be paid for their work, but only 14% of survey respondents agreed with that. So, what are your thoughts on that, Catalina? Should peer reviewers be compensated for their work? And if so, how?
Yeah, I was thinking about this for a long time myself. And my view is that the peer reviewers should be somehow recognized in a more formal way. This does not necessarily mean a financial recognition. Actually, I wouldn't be a part of very, very specific reviews for very long articles. But generally, what I think would be nice would be a kind of a symbolic recognition, like the credits or supports, institutional support. So to be recognized for the huge work you are doing. And being myself a peer review for various journals, I can say that the work involved, it's really, really important. But I see it as a mirror view. Sometimes I'm author and I would like to have a good reviewer of my paper. Sometimes I'm the reviewer herself. So yes, I do support the idea that one should have a recognition, a formal recognition for all this really important activity. But apart some specific cases, I don't necessarily think this should be financial, but eventually, as I was saying, a kind of a credit which you can use in your career, especially the young people who in their curriculum for various concourses, for competitions, they need to have something which helps them through.
I think that was a very popular opinion, Catalina. I'm not sure if I misspoke, but I should say that in the survey it was 59% of people agreed that peer reviewers should be compensated, but they gave lots of different examples of how, and mostly they weren't talking about monetary compensation, but they were talking about things like credit and receiving professional recognition for the act of carrying out peer review and, having that recognized by universities.
I fully share this opinion that it should be somehow recognized, because sometimes the activity and the effort you put into peer review an article, it's at least at the same level that authors put in writing it, if you are doing it properly. So yes, I totally share that view that it should be a recognition.
Now, a few science journals have been trialling paying peer reviewers and have been getting some interesting results. We asked reporter Geoff Marsh to speak with metascience experts and journal editors at Critical Care Medicine, Biology Open and at Research Hub, who have been experimenting with paying their peer reviewers differing amounts of money and even been paying them with their own cryptocurrency. Some have even been testing out the use of AI as peer reviewers in some capacity. They each reported varying levels of success in terms of whether the speed and quality of reviews were affected. But do we even need to be paying peer reviewers at all? Here's Geoff Marsh's report.
The question of whether peer reviewers should be paid isn't new. But what is new is the recent emergence in a handful of journals of real-world experiments that test the feasibility of implementing such a move. In this piece, I'll meet some of the people who've now got real data on the effect that monetary incentives have on their would-be reviewers. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's hear some of the main arguments for compensating reviewers.
It really is work. You can't casually peer review something. At an absolute minimum, you shouldn't casually peer review something. My name is Dr. James Heathers. I was a physiologist. Now I'm a forensic metascientist, which means I study how research processes go wrong. I realized there were going to be very few opportunities to research the mechanics of science, and that wasn't going to be a viable career pathway.
And is that a child I can hear?
No, it's a particularly annoying ginger cat. I'm going to feed him and exacerbate the problem in the hope that we get some peace and quiet.
Okay.
Which takes 30 seconds.
Well, that gives me just enough time to explain why I contacted James. A few years ago, he wrote a blog setting out his case for being paid to review papers, and it made a bit of a splash. He's quite vocal on this topic, and while many in the publishing world and academics themselves disagree with his proposal, his arguments in favour of paying professionals to scrutinise others' work make, I think, for an interesting starting point.
Okay.
In 2020, you launched a manifesto, didn't you, called the 450 Movement. Could you just tell me the story of that manifesto?
I had left formal academia, and I was in a world where it was very normal to write a contract. So I got a peer review request when I was working for money in a regular job. And my first thought was I should probably send them a contract.
And did you get a response?
In general, people move on to the next person, or they respond in utter confusion as if I've somehow misinterpreted the email they've sent for me in the first place. It is so welded to the idea of how academic work is supposed to be conducted. I've met too many marginalized people working for nothing who are continually beset with future glittering opportunities to continue to work for nothing. I've met graduate students who lived in their cars. I do not think you should be asking them to work for free. You can have all the prestige in the world, but you cannot pay your goddamn rent with it.
How did you settle on $450 as a fair payment for a review?
That was pretty straightforward. I have a formal consulting rate that's obviously higher, and I have an academic consulting rate that's significantly lower if I can be bothered charging it at all. So one way to ballpark these things is you take the low estimate of one and the high estimate of the other, and you multiply them together, and you see what the sort of rates kind of mash out to be.
Some of the arguments against paying any amount of money, let alone 450, is that the journals would just put all that cost of that straight on the authors. What's your response to that?
Well, on a macro level, so don't pay the fees. Submit it elsewhere. Start your own journal. You would see a growth in repositories that nonprofits and universities manage themselves. You would see more things working to a kind of archive model. You would see more people going, do you know what? It is actually not that hard to get journal management software and start our own journal.
Whether or not a critical mass of academics would take that principled approach and start their own journals is hard to know, although there are some researchers already opting for alternatives to some of the more expensive publishers for their manuscripts. Before I left James, I put to him a few more of the common arguments against his proposal to pay peer reviewers. Your suggestion of $450 isn't just $450 because there's probably 2 reviews, and that's also not taking into account the reviews that happened that didn't get published. And so you might be talking 2, 3, 4 times the $450.
Yeah, you also might not be talking about $450. That's what worked for me at the time. This is an open commercial question. You can construct the agreement any way you like.
Another criticism that I'm sure you've come up against a million times is this notion that paying peer reviewers would encourage unethical reviewing practices, both perhaps from the editors, but also maybe from those reviewers who might feel an incentive to kind of say what the editors want.
Maybe. But at the same time, if you have an honest editor, I think there are more advantages than disadvantages. They require a good review within a time frame, and if they don't get it, they won't pay you. And at the point in time where they're a steward of what is essentially company money at that particular point in time, audit them. Look at the reviews that are actually being produced. Put those in the public domain. And if you find one of them and you're just some scientist who's knocking around reading scientific papers like we all do, write to the journal. And I'm horrified when I see papers that have got open reviews and I read the peer reviews and people get this poxy little paragraph. And it just says, this seems like a reasonably good idea. You missed a comma on page 17. Best of luck with the paper. Finally, from an editor's perspective, they actually had the ability to compel people to do what they've said they're going to do. It's actually giving editors leverage. And of course, I think there should be strong exceptions to peer review being paid. If you have a society journal that is trying to maintain the academic backbone and standards of a specific community, then no.
And other non-profit journals?
What, to a degree. Non-profit journals occur along a continuum. There's a tremendous amount of largesse that's in regular publisher margins. And when it comes to gold open access papers in particular, which are the center of the problem with everything else right now, all of that money is reserved for the alleged maintenance of the journal. But more typically, it's reserved for shareholder profits, share buybacks, and executive compensation.
The academic publishing landscape is hugely varied, and so it's unlikely that one model is right or wrong for all peer review. But there are people running experiments into paying peer reviewers at their own journals, so let's meet some of them. And we'll start with the journal Critical Care Medicine.
For a number of years now, I was an associate editor at the journal, which meant handling manuscripts. It's an eye-opening experience to try to get enough expert peer reviews to move a manuscript through the editorial process.
Introduce yourself and then just tell me a little bit about just kind of, who you are.
Well, my name's David Maslov. I'm a clinician scientist at Queen's University and Kingston Health Sciences Centre in Kingston, Ontario. I work clinically in the intensive care unit and the general medical wards and do research in precision medicine in critical care alongside research and peer review, obviously. I can certainly recall handling some manuscripts, sending out invitations, and being met with either radio silence or, unfortunately, I'm too busy right now. I actually introduced my own incentive structure a little bit. I wouldn't call them incentives necessarily, but other means of coercion, so to speak, rather than sending the invitations just through the editorial manager software that sends out form letters to prospective reviewers. I would email them from my personal email address and say, hello, so-and-so, could you do me this personal favor and review this manuscript? But often it came to that.
It wasn't just frustration at unanswered emails or having to resort to emotional blackmail that pushed David to run an experiment into compensating reviewers. Critical Care Medicine, the clue's in the title, is a publisher of potentially life-saving information. So faced with a global pandemic, speeding up the transmission of reliable evidence was, well, critical.
There was a confluence of factors that really sort of added up to make it much more difficult than usual to get reviewers. For one thing, many of us who would do these reviews were busier than usual, to say the least. And then for another, we saw a huge increase in the amount of submissions to our journal around the biology of SARS-CoV-2 virus and how to treat patients with COVID-19, and also felt, a very urgent need and an obligation to get it vetted by experts and get it published. And so all of those factors together made it much more of a pressing issue. It sort of all came to a head. And I think we also kind of reflected at that point on some of the discussion going on in chat forums and on social media channels and these sorts of things, where the idea of paying people to do peer review was bandied about from time to time. But that debate has been occurring largely in a vacuum. Essentially, there's very little evidence as to whether paying people to do peer review would be an effective thing to do, or whether there'd be unintended consequences and these sorts of things. So I partnered with a professor of economics here at Queen's University named Christopher Cotton, and we designed this experiment and brought it to the journal with the proposal that we would actually run this and see what happens when you offer people a monetary incentive to do peer review and collect some empirical data to inform that debate.
In very specific terms, what was your question and how do you set up an experiment like this?
I couldn't help but think of it as a randomized control trial, the way we would do in medical research, where one arm gets the treatment, the other arm gets some sort of control intervention. And so we thought of it similarly along those lines. It would be great to, every time a review invitation goes out, they would randomly be assigned to either a cash incentive offer or the status quo, which is no financial incentive. And then at the end, we'd be able to sort of see what the response rates were. Doing that at the individual reviewer level proved to be just logistically impossible, given the way the editorial process at the journal works. So we adopted a sort of what we called a quasi-randomized methodology, in which we would take anyone who is getting invited to do peer review in a 2-week period would have one condition, and then it would switch over to the other condition for the next 2-week period, and so on and so forth until we had accrued our sample size.
So let's hear about the results then. Did the cash incentive work to get more people to say yes to reviews?
Yeah, so our experimental arm was an offer of $250 to accept a review and return a report within 2 weeks. And that 2-week time frame was the same between both conditions and didn't change from the background conditions before the study rolled out. And we found that there was a slight but statistically significant difference with an increase in the rate of return of a completed report with the cash incentive. And on average, it shortened the review time by about a day, which again is sort of context specific between different fields. So, and in the context of a public health pandemic, maybe that day makes a difference. And maybe it doesn't, because maybe there are other bottlenecks in that editorial process. That remains a bit of an open question.
But it's fair to say, though, isn't it, that the effect of the monetary incentive was modest?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It was the effect was there, but modest would be a fair way to frame it, I think.
And why do you think that is?
Hopefully we'll have a little more information from follow-on studies, but I imagine that the reviewers in our community at Critical Care Medicine are otherwise motivated rather than by a financial payment or a cash incentive. And for them, maybe that monetary incentive doesn't tip the scale enough. It may be that the dollar value was not calibrated correctly, and so hard to say if that was a player in there as well.
Were the reviews themselves different in their quality between the cash incentive and not?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and something that we worried about. So at the journal, our sort of standard operating procedures is for the handling editor to assign a numerical score to a review. We didn't get scores on every review that came in, but amongst the ones that had an editor score, there was no difference whatsoever in the quality of the review as adjudicated by the handling editors.
And I know your role is to, as objectively as possible, investigate these things fairly, but do you have a sort of, and if you don't mind sharing, do you feel personally that people should be compensated for peer review?
I wish I could have more clarity after my own experiment on this, but I can't necessarily say that I do. If there had been a very clear-cut answer from our study that paying people $250 led to the rapid return of high-quality reviews, then I think we would be thinking about how and when to deploy that. Obviously, it can't be deployed for every journal in every situation. That would be financially prohibitive in a lot of cases. But it may be more, there may be some journals that can explore those opportunities more so than others, and we continue to investigate what some of those important differences are between journals and between reviewers and between subject matters and the like.
So paying reviewers $250 wasn't the panacea some might have expected for speeding up the process amongst the critical care medicine community. Maybe, as David suggests, that's to do with their inherent motivations. But it might also be true that approaching this question like a randomized controlled trial, aiming to eradicate any bias, also eradicates some necessary buy-in from would-be reviewers.
It is interesting that I did not consider this to be an issue when I was a PhD student and a postdoc, because I assumed that it was the only way to do things. So I am Alejandra Clark. I'm the managing editor of the journal Biology Open, published by the Company of Biologists. As an editor, I found that there has been an issue with reviewers not being willing to review over time. You know, the time of working scientists is very precious, and also the number of papers that are being published is increasing quite highly. So, yes, it's something that as an editor, it's bugged me more because we couldn't get papers published in the time that we wanted to.
Where do you go from there? How did you set up the experiment?
Yeah, so that was interesting. I felt like being back in the lab. So we took two areas of the journal covered by two academic editors and looked at different ways of incentivizing reviewers. So we decided to test two kinds of contracts. One we thought would lead to better adoption from the reviewers, and that was payment upfront of 3 papers that they would review in a quarter.
Kind of like a retainer.
Yeah, so that's what we call the retainer contract. And the other contract was a freelancer, so a per manuscript contract. What we found was that both worked really well. But in terms of cost effectiveness, the retainer contract was way more expensive because it was very hard to predict the incoming number and type of manuscripts that would come in. We had cases where retainer reviewers were paid, but they were not invited because we just didn't have the papers that they were needed to review. So although both worked, at the end of last year, in December, we moved all the people that were on the retainer contract. We asked them if they wanted to continue participating in this, and all of them accepted and were very happy to do so. So they all moved to the freelancer contract. So we ran it for roughly for the 6 months, July to December 2024. And the metrics that we were looking at was the first decision, how long it took to provide that first decision post-peer review. And the other very important thing to look at was that the quality of the review process did not diminish because of the need to, work so quickly, both to academic editors and the reviewers.
And so tell me, how successful was it? First of all, let's talk about that sort of turnaround time.
So all 20 papers in that pilot study reached that decision time within less than 7 working days. We compared what we would call the control cohort of papers, so the papers that were handled by the other 8 academic editors in that same time period. And the average time to that first decision was about 40 days. And importantly, all the reviews that were submitted as part of that also were of deemed to be good quality by the academic editors.
Do you have an opinion on why the quality was just as high? Why did this work, this 7-day turnaround?
My gut feeling on this is that because we set out such clear expectations on the type of review that we wanted, and because there was the added compensation to that, the reviewers complied to that.
But that sounds like more about the reviewer guidance. I mean, specifically, what impact do you think the compensation had?
I don't know, but personally, on each one of the reviewers, what we found was that the people who signed up were very committed to what we were trying to do. So they were willing to experiment. Also because the academic editor, the editor-in-chief, is a working scientist. I think that connection between, everyone involved in the process. And they felt that it was meaningful, I guess.
So it sounds like this trial back in 2024 was a real success. Have you guys gone back to the old ways, unpaid reviews, slow turnaround times, or have you adopted this for the whole journal?
Yeah, so the last year pilot was what we consider the phase 1 of the experiment. This year is phase 2. So what we're testing this year is the scalability of this fast and fair peer review process. But to do that, we need to be sure that we've got sufficient reviewers that cover all areas of biology. So we're continuously recruiting reviewers to fill in the gaps of subject areas we may in the future receive a paper in.
That's interesting, because you might expect that the limiting factor for scaling this up would just be the pure economics of it from the journal's point of view. But it sounds like you're saying it's actually people power.
To begin with, the scalability testing this year is testing just that. The financial side of things, we do have money put aside to pay the peer reviewers for this year based on what we expect will be the submissions coming in that will undergo peer review. For next year, we'll look into the financial sustainability of the initiative if, the experiment continues to work at scale.
On the economics, what do you say to the skeptics who say that, it's not just £220 per paper because, you might send one paper out to 3 different reviewers, and after all that, it may be rejected. So you may actually be talking about vast sums of money.
For the time being at Biology Open, the way that we've set this experiment, we are using 2 reviewers per paper. And we've got an idea of how, again, over the years, the percentage of papers that have been rejected over time post peer review. But it's something that we're constantly looking at. So we'll have more data on this next year.
Did you get any sense during your pilot, or do you have any thoughts on whether financial incentives could lead to kind of bad review practices?
So what I can tell you that we're doing is that the system that we have in place to monitor the quality of the reviews is such that if we notice a review that has been submitted that doesn't meet our standards, that reviewer will not be paid for that review. And in the 20 papers that we've put through the system last year, all the manuscripts met this quality aspect. Since then, we've had 1 or 2 that didn't. One was too superficial and not in detail at all. And on the other one, it was just a review that was submitted 1 day late, which is still amazingly quick, but again, not as per the expectations of the contract. So in both cases, we fed back, and we hope that by continuing to feed back, people will, hopefully it would avoid this kind of effect from taking place. And for readers, we are also publishing the review reports alongside the published manuscript so that anyone in principle can look at the quality of the review process of the journal.
So Biology Open's pilot into paying peer reviewers last year was relatively small, just 20 papers, but the results were promising enough that they're moving ahead with further exploration. I'm sure that by the end of 2025, they'll have a lot more to say on the feasibility of scaling up. Our final test case is Research Hub, who not only pay for some of their reviews, but they do so with their very own cryptocurrency.
So I'm Jeffrey Corey. I'm the president and director at the Research Hub Foundation, and I come from traditional academic background, PhD in biomedical sciences with a focus in neuroimmunology and virology. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk about kind of the developments we've had on the paid peer review side of things and what that's unlocked for a lot of the researchers on our platform.
What, as you see it, is the problem with the current publishing landscape?
Yeah, so specifically with peer review, the part that's particularly frustrating is the turnaround time for peer review. It's actually what disenfranchised me quite a bit during my PhD program, because you get stuck in the queue for months. Some problem papers can be 6 months or more. And the part that I thought was frankly kind of egregious was the fact that these reviewers are not paid at all for the work that they've done. You know, for every other service you do, especially as a kind of trained expert, you should get paid for the work that you do. And the knock-on effects of that have been delays in the manuscripts. So I was a big proponent and excited about the idea of preprints, but preprints don't have this level of quality control on top of it.
What is the thinking behind Research Hub?
So Research Hub itself is a software platform where researchers can come and get anything from funding to publishing to peer review done. We have the ability to publish native preprints on there. We're also importing preprints from all the different preprint venues, so Archive, bioRxiv, preprints.org, Research Square. And then there's also a layer of peer review. We're calling it a peer review marketplace, where people can incentivize peer review on native preprints, on preprints from all these other venues that all are kind of, it's all an overlay on top of that, which is what the peer review marketplace is. And we're actually partnered with a couple of different journals. And these journals are also leaning into our peer review marketplace to test out to see, once they get stuck with papers that they can't find peer reviewers for, can they unlock that paper using our services?
Is it right to say that you're also publishing papers in the way that a Science or a Nature would?
Yes, so we have two kind of publishing flows. One of them would be publishing native preprints onto Research Hub. You can go publish your content, you get a DOI, and it's preprinted on Research Hub. You can go reference it. You can incentivize peer review on top of that preprint if you'd like. And then we have a Research Hub journal, and this is more of like an actual bona fide traditional journal. And really a big part of the editorial job is to vet the reviews that are coming in. And that way we know we're paying people for, quality work, and can definitely get into that a little bit more, because we've seen a lot of unique things coming out of our system because it's so different. Things like how quick peer review is done. We have an average time of about 10 days or so. We have a real diverse set of peer reviewers coming in from people globally. Because we're paying reviewers, we can actually have them jump through, I'll call them hoops, but it's just a level of rigor that you can expect because there's an economic incentive on the other side of it. Oftentimes with peer review, traditionally, you'll see your reviewer's comments and there'll be 3 sentences. And it's really unfortunate because these are the arbiters of your life's work.
It's interesting that you say that, because one of the criticisms leveled at the idea of paying for peer review is that you will cause these bad incentives, and you'll get people, doing reviews outside of their field of expertise and, quickly and rushing them. Sounds like you're saying actually the reviews have been more robust.
I think compared to like the grand majority of reviews you see, they've been much more robust. Now, I don't want to minimize what you just described, which is there is an incentive for people to come in beyond their fields of expertise, and we do see that as well too. And now with kind of the advent of AI and LLMs, people are able to fill the gap a little bit more when they're outside of their fields of expertise. But that's actually why we have our editors who are in the fields of expertise. That's why they're there to quality control the work. And one of the beauties here too is we have open peer review. Every user is public with their kind of image when they're doing the peer review. And so other reviewers or other scientists from the scientific community come in and they respond back to the peer review and say, hey, I think that what you claimed here is actually not true. And so you have that public discourse and context that's out there in the open. And that's another thing that's like not talked about as much, but it's a level of quality control from the entire scientific community that has eyeballs on it.
You've made a good case for why you should pay reviewers, but tell me the rationale behind ResearchCoin and why choose a crypto?
So one of the big reasons is global distribution of payments. With digital assets and cryptocurrencies, you can send transactions to people at fractions of a penny, and you can send it to people globally. And we know that there's a lot of really qualified researchers in a lot of areas where banking is not particularly the strong point. And we found that a lot of people from those areas are coming to our platform to get these kinds of payments. The other reason is ResearchCoin has the ability to govern certain aspects of the platform. So maybe how much ResearchCoin gets emitted per year for different things. Maybe the research or science community wants to focus on peer review. Maybe they want to focus on, giving money towards funding. Maybe they want to go in and incentivize people to publish open access and open data. We think that ultimately the community of ResearchCoin holders should be the decision makers for that in the long run, rather than, say, kind of an entity that has different incentives.
If it was just fiat cash that people were paying, but there was still this community, why couldn't they influence those sorts of things if it was traditional money rather than crypto?
Yeah, so with crypto, the amount of ResearchCoin that you've earned, for example, and we're kind of looking into maybe bundling this together with reputation as well too. So you have a reputation that you build up on the platform from using it, and then you also have the amount of ResearchCoin that you've earned. And in theory, the amount of ResearchCoin you've earned through the platform is sort of a proxy for like how engaged and committed you are to Research Hub as a platform. And so that's kind of the reason why we would like to use the token as a proxy for governance, because it shows the people who are like particularly dedicated to and are the users of the platform, which probably should have a much larger say in kind of the decisions of that platform.
I don't know if my information is up to date, but I think it was like $150 worth that you're paying for peer reviews. Is that right? How did you settle on the amount?
Yeah, it is $150 per peer review in ResearchCoin. We kind of had it set to $150 just because the rough time to do a peer review, can range anywhere from, 3 to 5 hours or something like that. And we thought just from an hourly rate, that was something that was at least reasonable for, researchers to do. We also have talked about this internally with our editorial team around this idea that, there's some papers that have 2 figures, they're quite easy to parse through. There's some behemoth papers that are going to go get submitted into Nature. So we are talking a bit about like tiering the peer review amounts for different sized papers. But beyond that, one thing we're interested in trying here, and if there's any Nobel laureates that are out there in the audience, we would actually like to pay quite a bit of a premium to have, say, a Nobel laureate come in and peer review a preprint or peer review a proposal that's going out for funding, for example.
I don't really know anything about crypto. The one thing I do hear about it a lot is that it's a really volatile thing.
Yeah, and it's going up and down all the time. The kind of volatility of the asset is a very interesting one because it definitely changes kind of the sentiment and engagement of people that are using the platform. When the price is going down, you can feel a general kind of maybe a little bit of more worry with people. You can see people come out of the woodworks on some social medias and, say some things. And then when the value is going up, you have these users on your platform that kind of become missionaries for your platform. But something for us to keep monitoring.
Whilst ResearchCoin rises and falls in value, along with the enthusiasm amongst the Research Hub community for it, it turns out there's a new cohort of reviewers in development who will surely remain unfazed.
We actually have an entire AI peer review development that's underway that is much more stellar than I think people are anticipating. And the way it's kind of developed is we have an AI editor that reads the paper, and these are AI agents. And so an AI editor reads the paper and selects 3 AI reviewers that are experts in various fields that are relevant to that paper. So if I'm an AI neuroscientist, I'll give them kind of feedback on the neuroscience aspects of the paper. Maybe I'm an AI statistician, I'll give the statistics outputs. And the reviews are, I was very surprised, the reviews are really, really good. So, yeah.
That sounds like it almost runs counter to what you've been saying about building this community of human scientists. Presumably, if these AI reviews became really good, you'd have no incentive to pay people, and then this digital ecosystem might collapse.
Yeah, I think that kind of is why I brought up the idea that these things are scoring an 8 out of 10 in terms of like quality of output. They still need human oversight on them, and they still need human assessment and humans to even fill in some of the missing gaps that are kind of not claimed within those AI reviews. And so I think there's still going to be a world where it's going to be symbiotic between the two, but rather than a human reviewer going in and spending 3 of the 4 hours of the review working on the thing that the AI review would have just printed you in, 2 minutes, they can actually just really focus on that extra 1 hour, premium that they have over the AI review, that they can kind of fill in the gap. And then what you ultimately get is much quicker and much more like thorough peer reviews that actually have good oversight onto the entirety of the paper.
It remains to be seen how these newfangled AI reviewers will play out, or if compensating human reviewers will ever become mainstream in academic publishing. But I think David Maslov articulated best the one thing that we can be certain about.
For us, regardless of the result that we saw, I think one of the big takeaways from this is that research can be done in this area, and we can actually find ways to bring empirical evidence to this debate, which otherwise was informed by opinion, but little else. So there's a great deal to be learned and to be investigated and studied, and hopefully a little more willingness from scientists and researchers and publishers and funders to engage in this in order to bring some data to that question.
Thank you to James Heathers, David Maslov, Alejandra Clark, and Jeffrey Corey for taking the time to speak with reporter Geoff Marsh. So, Catalina, we heard about a number of different ways to pay there. Some journals are paying cash, as we heard, but there are other journals out there, including the family of journals PeerJ, who pay with tokens, so that if you carry out a certain number of peer reviews for them, then say they will waive the fee they would usually charge you as an author if you choose to author a paper with them. We did contact PeerJ's leadership team for comment for this piece, but they responded that their current organizational commitments and priorities mean that they are unable to participate in the podcast. So there you go, all very mysterious. And of course, perhaps most intriguingly, we heard that Research Hub is paying peer reviewers with their own cryptocurrency research coin. So Catalina, does this sound interesting to you, any of these projects? I mean, maybe they do, maybe they don't.
No, it doesn't. Because already life is very complicated. Needing to deal with also cryptocurrency, at least for me, would be too much complicated. What the scientists mostly care about, if they only care about money, that I would be worried about serial peer reviewers, to be honest.
So people perhaps get so excited about being paid a healthy sum for doing peer review that they just start doing more and more of them. And, there's the slight worry that maybe they won't be as thorough at reviewing because they just want to do lots and lots of them, churn them out, get lots of cash, and it's maybe in their best interests that they pass these papers through the peer review process. This was something that, again, it did come up in our survey, and it does come up in our articles on the website keyspace.fqxi.org/podcasts. We'll put links to that multi-part article, that investigation, which has a lot of different opinions about the problems or not with peer review and how to fix them, and also other problems with scientific journals.
But yeah, I can agree that if you need to pay a fee for some journals, usually I try to publish in open access journals. But if you need still to pay a fee, the good idea would be to compensate the peer reviewers with some bonus that they don't need to pay the fee or similar thing. So what I would like to see is that young people, especially young people who are doing this effort, they see this recognized in their curriculum. So they have an institutional recognition of the huge effort and activity they do in peer reviewing various articles.
And we will be putting links to all of the journals and all of the efforts mentioned in Geoff Marsh's piece on the site too. One intriguing twist that came up at the end there was the use of AI tools to help with reviewing at Research Hub. Now we note that this field moves very fast, but all of that was the state of the matter at the time of recording back in spring. But on that topic of the use of AI in reviews, I'm going to add a link to an article dedicated to the idea of AI paper proofers, looking at the benefits and the dangers of using AI to review science papers, written by reporter Nicola Jones. Now that's all we have time for today, so thank you again to everyone that has contributed to the podcast. Niayesh Afshordi and Alice Chen, James Heathers, David Maslov, Alejandra Clark, Jeffrey Corey and Geoff Marsh. And especially a big thank you to you, Catalina Curceanu.
Perfect. Thank to you, Zeeya. Thank you very much, and to all those who are listening and are with us.
As always, you can contact us and keep up to date with all things FQxI on socials. You can email us at podcast@fqxi.org. You can subscribe to the podcast on qspace.fqxi.org or on YouTube, where you can also watch our videos and talks. And if you go to QSpace, you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you're up to date on things like FQxI's latest competitions. Thank you for listening. I've been Zeeya Merali.